And that's the end. Time for questions.
Same drill. Approach the microphones to pose your questions. While people are going to go to the microphone, don't be shy. Any of your carburetors been questioned by the tech authorities? Any of that sort of stuff?
Oh, yes, we have an ongoing game. NASCAR and myself, they have the on-the-spot John rules regularly. They had the 2001 3-gauge rule, oh yeah, and +1 for John. I had a carburetor brought down that absolutely passed NASCAR 3-gauge rule, period, and right there on the spot, they made a 4th rule for me. Just for me. Because, well, we'll let that one go while we did it, but the rule was 3 gauges, they did. So yes, on a regular bull, I have a thing with NASCAR, or plate carburetors when they bring them down. And I enjoy the fact that we have a nice working relationship. It's not something that they know I'm not trying, I don't build anything that's cheating, but if you give me rules, you just gave me a place of things I don't have to do, you gave me all the things I can do. So the gentleman to my left.
Could you elaborate on the natural frequency of fuel that you talked about? I don't understand that.
Well, all things, glass, whatever, comes to certain kinds of natural frequency where, let's say crystal, which is very familiar, it'll break. And the same thing with liquids. They'll seek to be apart from themselves. So when you bring something to its natural frequency, it seeks not to be next to itself. It wants to separate from itself. And that's, you know, from the little clues that I get here at these conferences, I was able to figure some of this out. That's why I really try hard to come here and show, and a picture's worth 1,000 words, and maybe I could have made each of those in just words, but I really wanted to show what I had learned from coming to this conference as well.
What would that natural frequency be?
Yeah, the actual number I don't know, sir. I try not to remember all of those numbers. My head gets clogged enough as it is.
I would like to ask you about a number.
What number, sir?
What size are the droplets that you're getting where it's reducing?
I heard you talking to Tim the other night about that. So I even changed chairs with Bud so I could get a little closer. And I was saying to myself later, I'd love to have all your instruments to check those droplet sizes.
That was my next question.
We don't have the instruments to actually measure the droplet size, you know, in the flow fixture. But after seeing this for as many years I've been watching, and we see the progression to smaller, but at some point, I'm sure I'm going to need to buy those things. So you're going to ask me that question.
Well, yeah, I can show you the instrument that we use to do that.
Right.
It's a very clever, high-tech deal. So you don't have any idea what the droplet size is?
I don't actually know, but to give you an idea, if you were to see it, you've seen droplet sizes.
Yes.
We're going back, been using this wet bench for probably 17 years now. So figuring, when I heard you mention yesterday about a 90 micron droplet, all right, if we were looking at droplets now, and I heard you saying, I would guess we're probably in the 20 range, could be less.
20?
They're pretty small.
Yeah, that's excellent.
They're very small. And the one thing about the thing that when you...
I'm going to hold you to 20 then.
Hey, you know what? That's fine. But the other thing that became really interesting about the development of this one patent, and the jet industry approached me after I had it done. I also have a patent for a fuel nozzle for a jet. And we made a visualization of this up. And no, I didn't check this big visualization. I took some clear tubing, and we made the rendering of the rings that we used and the emulsion holes that we used in it. And we made the second fuel well with standard emulsion, which would stratify, which means it's layered in its form, and which now I call aeration rather than emulsion. And what the DAM system came out is a bunch of pearls through the system. Just like you would see a young lady's pearl necklace. Well, that's how the droplets, and remembering that the edge of the droplet, the vapor, is where it becomes important. So if you look at standard emulsion being stratified, where the air enters and the fuel enters, it may get some mixing, some aeration, but tends to want to keep the lights, all right? The fuel tend to hover on one side, and the greater part of the air will stay to the side where the air enters. But once you went to the system where we were doing cascading, sharing, and natural frequency, it came out in a ring of pearls in the visualization.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome, Dee.
I'm kind of the opinion, thinking here about your natural frequency of the fuel, that you probably have a Helmholtz resonance going on
Absolutely.
between the cavity
Yep.
and the booster channel
Yep.
over to the booster. Once again, you've opened up my mind to some whole new concepts. Thank you.
You're welcome.
If you can briefly comment, or if there's something you could say for this group about something you also tickled my mind with a while ago, which is the filling of the clearance volume during the overlap cycle. You had gotten Wild Hair to look into that and think about it. I remember you're turning your cylinder head upside down and sucking through the exhaust pipe during an overlap cycle.
Right.
Is there anything more you can comment about on that today?
Well, yes, because when Bob was speaking, as he was getting up to his pressure on the positive side in the head, the income side getting above the other, just maybe at the time I was sitting back at my table thinking about that's what's happening when the head gets better. As the head gets better, we're beginning to pull overlap out of it again. When these heads are getting so good, when you're talking about a 2125 valve and you look at the number, the port area at the smallest part is 2.7 something square inches. That's a pretty efficient port. Well, you're getting the ability to accelerate the intake charges, and I'm going to get back to Alan's thing there, really allows you to begin to minimize the overlap loss. But the problem becomes when the port really gets as good as it is, carrying too much airspeed, it kills you. And one of the things, and I want to reiterate this, when you're doing dyno work, it's the way you tell if you're carrying too much airspeed is from peak horsepower to peak RPMs. See, a lot of the presentation is going to be giving the little things, but this is like the meat part. The more power you lose from peak horsepower to peak RPMs is the more speed you're carrying. Bad. All right, you may have the best port in the world, but what you need to do now is carry a little less peak speed, and you do that by pulling nose area out of the camshaft. All right, so when the port is reaching peak and it's going up, and you may make a lot of power, but then you don't realize it. But once you get to peak power and going from peak power to peak RPMs, if you're carrying too much speed, you're going to lose 50 horsepower, like per 100. I mean, it doesn't fall off a little bit because now you're trying to overcome that increased velocity as it goes the wrong way. True thing, and I brought my other conference, which is this much papers. The true way for the valve to work, if you time it right, is at the point when the compressing forces in cylinder are equalized at the valve, and at that point the valve should close. The trick is acquiring it. Alluding back to what Alan had said, what we used to do is take the engine during the overlap cycle, hook the header up, and then flow the engine assembled by rotating it to see what the overlap flow figures were. Well, geez, I've changed so much since then and what we're doing, because also the thing that comes to mind is when I'm looking at the engine's ability to increase power, and these are process of thought right now. I think the term that they use for compression ratio, or the difference between the swept volume and the space. I think as we increase pressure, like they do with a turbo, we're actually going to have to increase the distance between the piston and the chamber to support that increased charge density, i.e. the same as a turbo guy would do. I find a lot of the time when I'm stuck for knowing what's going on, I look into the turbo world, because as we improve the exchange of air that we're putting into these engines, they've already done it. So it really does follow once you get to a certain point. And that's when he was saying about cutting out the overlap. It just so happens that with the cylinder heads that we're developing today, what we've been doing is moving event timing. That's what I also alluded to, and I'm glad that Billy's going to be doing a thing. Event timing is the whole thing. You're taking the exhaust closing event and moving it closer to TDC, i.e. pulling more of that overlap that he was saying out of the engine as you improve both the ability to blow down and your ability to fill the cylinder on the next cylinder filling. First, I'm sorry. Hi, Billy.
Hey, John. Quick question.
Yes, sir.
On your port design, it was angled, directional port was going a little bit toward the wall. You know, if you look from the carburetor, how it comes back down toward the wall.
Correct.
There's a lot of talk about whether toward the wall is better or toward the center of the chamber is better.
Mm-hmm.
Just your thoughts on it real quick.
Well, it depends on if you have the ability for complete tumble or don't, and the piston distance from the peak of the chamber. If, in this case, it's a fairly short stroke engine, and you remember it's a system-wide approach, not just a cylinder head approach. If I was to go directly across the chamber, that means that the flow path would have to be confined to the distance between the top of the piston at bottom dead center, because that's where the flow is going, and the chamber. All right, in a slower stroke engine, depending on the amount of airspeed, the kinetic energy could give you droplet release. So in this case, being it's a short stroke, small displacement engine at a fairly high RPM, I wanted the engine not to be too much swirl, too much tumble. We were all through that at the time. So when I angled the port, I really wanted to see that we could get the greatest the in-cylinder motion. To not only do that, but to take the plug into consideration for the flame front development. Once again, system-wide approach. So I chose this for that reason. If I was going to use a medium stroke engine, I might have chose that. If I was going to use a long stroke engine, I would have gone for bore supported droplets. I would have gone as they have in the canted valve Chevy, in the Pro Stock type Chevy, where the bore is now a supported flow to the conventional port. All right, so as the droplets come in, we're supporting those droplets so that they can't flow out of that flow path with the bore itself. So a lot of it depends on that system-wide approach. Did that help? You're welcome. Dima?
Now that brings me to two things.
That's fine.
Piston shape plays a very important influence as far as tumble or mixture motion then for your short stroke engine versus long stroke engine. And I've seen a lot of piston shapes really hurt total power.
Absolutely.
Because you don't have even burn. You have a lot of wet spots, etc. My question, the reason I came up here to start with was that you said you had 700 horsepower to start with. You were going for 800. Have you dyno tuned that engine?
This is a still quite finished project. My carburetor stuff has taken so much time. And besides getting hurt, but the development part of that is to see if it had an engine that had the capabilities of doing that. And even today, with the flow figures available, I believe in the components that are available, that this engine will do that.
So we have to wait for the 14th AETC.
You may have to do that, and hopefully I won't get hit again. Your second question? Oh, in reference to the piston shape, absolutely. One of the things, and this is, you can go back to some of the turbo things too. One fellow was here a couple years ago, and when you're looking for a lot of in-cylinder motion, the piston has to be a part of that thought. If I could make pistons flat or use them to enhance that motion, I certainly would. I think part of what we've seen with these shallow valve angles, a lot of this stuff is backing the engine builders and who aren't aware into shallower dome pistons. All right. We built some 10-to-1 stuff that has brake specifics in the middle 30s. And, EGTs, which in our case we like to run to the lean side of stoichiometric, i.e. what Bob was saying, in the 800 range, the 700 range, that's a 10-to-1 motor. So, yes, flat, small domes. When doing domes, I make the valve head as part of the dome configuration. So what that means is we would place the valves themselves into the dome of the piston. It would be smooth, so that during crossflow, what Alan was asking about, there is no impedance to crossflow during overlap. Everything is smooth, i.e., once again, that dilution ratio. See, I'm better up here when I'm asking questions because I can tie all that better in. Because what you're trying to do is after you've worked so hard to get that new intake charge in, is to not contaminate it and or lose it by shortcutting it through. So as it comes into the engine, you want it to sweep the old stuff out and then shut itself off. Hopefully that helped you. This gentleman here.
Well, you've talked about pistons a lot now, and you certainly mentioned stroke. What about rod length and rod stroke ratio?
Oh, if you were here in early conferences, I hear the guys chuckling that we're here in early conferences. We used to have fist fights over that one. That was one reason why I went to the 8200 deck Ford. Back then, I was building engines in the 18-to-1 compression ratio range. It was completely unheard of. People said it wasn't possible and stuff, but I was doing it in 2 or 3 or 4 years later a Winston Cup. Once again, I figured if the turbo guys could squeeze it, we'll squeeze it. That's what I did. We started busting up parts. And I said, the turbo guys are using a 1-inch wrist pin. We'll put a 990 wrist pin in it. So, I seriously, and we were breathing in low VEs, like Bob was saying. Well, now we figured out how to tune the pulses and stuff. When the VEs jumped up, and we started really managing these things. So we went to short rods, and I'm telling you, there was a lot of guys that had lots of different views on that. But it was because if you take an infinitely long rod and you put pressure on it, I always take a pencil, and you push vertical on this pencil or pen. All right, I don't care how hard I push, I'm not moving it. I drive the caps off, the head's out, and spit the gaskets out. You don't make rotational energy until you come off vertical. So what you're trying to do is get to the soonest point, depending on where you want peak pressure. I'm really good on a fly. You want the greatest leverage angle as close to TDC as possible, i.e. short connecting rods. All right. When you do that, then you can look at peak pressure versus average pressure. That was the next thing that became helpful in high-speed burning. Making the droplets smaller and putting air around them, is we were really looking for a lot of high-speed burn rate. You know, there you could have less lead, turn the linear energy into rotational energy much quicker. And so we went to the reason why we built the 8200 deck. At the time, we were literally milling the block to the bolt holes for the bell housing on Chevrolet blocks, using 5-inch 450 rods. And we felt with the same thing, we could, you know, if we wanted to, we could go shorter because of the burn rate. And if you, at the time, this is where I'm changing. At the time, we were talking about building that engine into 20 to 21 range compression. Well, that's before today. I really believe that we need space for the energy, the charge density. So I would change that from that discussion then for what I've learned from then to now. If you're making 800 horsepower, not only do you need to carry that in the charge area, but the charge density needs to be addressed in cylinder. All right. There's probably an ideal space volume, forget the compression ratio, ideal combustion volume for every horsepower rating. That's my belief. And so you'd have to seek that number. At some point I probably could say X horsepower needs a certain amount of crown area. I don't have that answer yet, but I believe that.
Now the $60,000 question, is there a certain rod stroke ratio you aim for with these normally aspirated engines?
What keeps the pistons from folding up? If you have the rod too long, the first thing that'll happen before you bust something else is you lay over the skirts on the pistons. If you are currently laying the skirts over on your pistons, your rods are too long. All right, it really becomes down to a pilage of broken parts. You'll also find as soon as you turn things, because at that point you have to look for things that's going to fail. ARP is making a great bunch of fasteners. Felpro, Detroit are making the head gaskets better. The heads are getting thicker in the deck. We've run out of things to bend and break. The rods are getting better. These blocks have caps. Man, they're bolted everywhere. The only thing left to break is laying over the skirt. Okay, so it shows up there. Or compressing the pin end of a connecting rod. We went through that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You had mentioned in the carburetors that you're building, the carburetor bodies, that you move the mean area above the discharge area
Yes.
completely, which means that now the discharge area is totally within the diffusion cone.
Correct.
Is there a short answer to explain how that keeps your air-fuel curve constant with velocity?
Well, that also becomes in what you're doing with the internal metering in the metering blocks. What I find is the more pressure you put the fuel under, the easier it is to manage. To give you an idea between the two counterparts, below and above mean area carburetor, and it'll say 600 flow range. The conventional below mean area carburetor would use a 73 jet with a 32 air bleed. The above mean area carburetor will use a 54 air bleed with a 63 jet. So just figure out how much smaller that droplet got when you're emulsifying it that much more. So you really can bleed the thing off by your internal metering in the metering block, but the greater the pressure is on the emulsion system, the better it is to break the droplet up. Did that help?
Yes.
Sure.
Questions? Any other questions? Last chance. 1, 2, 3, 4. No other questions? Thank you very much, John. Thank you.